Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week we've got an episode that I'm viewing sort of like an episode of Mythbusters, but for limited magic. We're taking a look at some of the most common phrases and sayings that limited players say, and we're going to see how much truth there is behind them. Most of these phrases, I'm sure you've heard at your local game store, or maybe on a stream or a podcast. Stuff like, math is for blockers, and greed is good, and maybe something a little more specific like, you should play 16 lands in best of one. And some of these, like, math is for blockers, or greed is good, you might be thinking, okay, Alex, like, these are just jokes, these are just things that Magic players say, don't take them too seriously, they're just facetious. But I actually think a lot of these jokes are grounded in reality to some extent. I think there's a kernel of truth behind a lot of them. So that's what we're up to today. All of this, of course, is in the name of honing your understanding of the game. I want to try to confirm or bust a lot of these sayings, and, like I mentioned, kind of tease out some of the kernels of truth for ones that I don't really necessarily agree with. And ever so quickly, before we jump in, I do want to shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. You know, at this point, it's the place you can go if you'd like to support the show, if you'd like access to a bunch of benefits like deck tech help and draft log reviews. You do get access to that stuff even at the lower tiers. So if you want to support the show, or if you want to level up your game, go check that out. Patreon.com/limitedlevelups. All right, let's jump in with one of the funnier ones, one of the more lighthearted ones. Mentioned this in the intro, but let's talk about the phrase, math is for blockers. I should also say, by the way, that to prep for this episode, I asked my Twitter followers and my Discord users what they considered the most common phrases that limited Magic players use, the ones that they hear often, and math is for blockers was LSV's contribution to this. The context that math is for blockers gets used in often is you're the player of the match that's trying to beat down, you're trying to kill your opponent, and your board's pretty wide, but your opponent's board's pretty wide too, and you're sitting there trying to do the math of what you should attack with and how much damage you can push, if too many of your creatures are going to get eaten in your attack, maybe trying to consider if your opponent has a removal spell in hand. And after 30 seconds of figuring this out, you go, you know what, whatever, math is for blockers, attack all. I want my opponent to do this math. You can figure this out, opponent. And I imagine when this was first said, like in my head, I'm thinking it's like at a GP, maybe a bunch of people watching an important match, and one player goes into the tank and starts thinking, and then they just say, oh, okay, whatever, you know what, math is for blockers, attack all. And that's a really good joke, right? I imagine this just started as a really funny joke. And it is a really good joke, but it's such a good joke that it got repeated over and over and over again, to the point where people that heard the joke at some point didn't have that original context of, this is just a joke and you shouldn't take this as actual strategic advice. And I say this is one of the more lighthearted ones because I don't think most people see this as actual strategic advice, but I do think there are some people who do think so. So I would say this one is firmly busted. Just do not take this math is for blockers as advice. In fact, you should very, very much do all the math if you can. Of course, there's going to be some games just too hard to figure out. You're like, you know, I'm just going to give my best bet. I'm just going to try to figure out, you know, what I can do. And if the board is too wide, it's too complex, I'm just going to do what I think is best. But if you have the time, if you have the mental energy in the game, math is for attackers. Like, more than anything else, it's way more for the attacker than for the blocker, because you're the one who has to commit to the decision. Your opponent's just responding to that decision that you made. Now, I do think that the kernel of truth behind this is you should probably attack a little bit more than you are now. I think the average limited Magic player doesn't attack enough. And partially because they're a little bit afraid of going, well, I make a big attack and, oh, no, that actually wasn't very good for me. I didn't do the math and I got too many of my creatures eaten without dealing too much damage, right? That is something that I think a lot of players experience, and they're a little bit tepid about attacking here and there. If you think you're one of those players, push yourself to attack a little bit more, because it just means that your intuition on how much you should attack and what a board state that makes for a good attack looks like is a little bit off. It's tuned too much to the side of being conservative. So what I would say to fix this, if you do think you're somebody who maybe doesn't attack enough, doesn't make your opponent say maths is for blockers, but at the right time, often enough, you want to try to retune your intuition by pushing way on the opposite end of things, right? Start attacking in spots where, you know, your brain is telling you, oh, I don't know about this. But then you hear the other part of your brain goes, you know, but I know I don't attack enough. So let me just see. This looks like kind of a reasonable spot to do it. Like, I was on the fence about it, and my intuition normally tells me I shouldn't attack here. If you find yourself in those situations, just go for the attack. And the more you can do that, the more you get experience and reps just making that attack and seeing how things pan out, you get a larger sample size for your intuition. You got to train your intuition that way. I actually recommended this exact thing in a coaching session the other day, and I think you can apply that sort of intuition training of, wait, if you're on one side way too far, push way on the opposite direction and you can kind of adjust from there. You can apply it to a lot of things that you might have a deficit in Magic, whether that be being too conservative in splashing colors in draft, or being too conservative or overzealous in your mulligans. Really just try to do the opposite of what you're doing now if you feel like you're doing something wrong. Because here's the thing, there is definitely a threat of pushing too far in the opposite direction, right? You're trying to get dead center here. But if you don't push far enough, you can't see what is too far in that direction of, oh, now I'm attacking way too much. So you want the sample size of, I know I'm a player who often doesn't attack when they should, plus that sample size of, well, I'm doing something that I wouldn't normally do. I've attacked, 10 times in the past 6 drafts or whatever in spots I wouldn't normally. And you can start to see the pros and cons of each. And since you're feeding your intuition more data by doing the thing you don't usually do, your intuition starts to naturally train itself and you will arrive in that middle ground where you should be more often. I think a poor intuition really is just not seeing the big picture and therefore not being able to make a better decision. With being able to see the big picture and just seeing all the aspects, all the factors that go into what makes a good or poor attack, you'll arrive at the right conclusion a little bit more often than not. And like I said, I think you can apply this to things that aren't just combat. A lot of Magic things you can train your intuition on this way. Next up, we have the phrase, you should always play 16 lands in best of 1 draft. And this is one that I've danced around on multiple episodes before, but never really have gotten a chance to deep dive on it. So I think this is a good opportunity to do so. As you know, 17 lands, that's the gold standard in your limited deck. It's been the gold standard for a long time. Sometimes you go to 16 because your curve is very low. Sometimes you go to 18 because your curve is very high. But your default should be 17. And the reasons why we play 17, 2 big ones really. Number 1, to make sure you have enough sources of each of your colors in 2 color decks. Because if you go below 8 sources of a main color, that really hurts your chances of casting a card in your main color. And the other big reason is so that we can hit 4 lands on turn 4 with consistency each game. I think if you're playing 17 lands, and this is non-hand smoothing, by the way, all this is just, I'm talking about if you're replacing paper. When you play 17 lands, your chances of hitting 4 lands by turn 4, I think is about 80%. 4 or greater, I should say. And most limited decks want to do that. They want to hit their 4th land on turn 4, even in your aggressive decks, so you can start double spelling. I think a lot of people neglect the fact that getting to 4 and 5 lands in your aggro decks is still good, because double spelling is how you pull ahead in your aggro decks very often. And then, of course, best of 1 arena comes along, and there's a hand smoother. And for those who don't know the exact inner workings of the hand smoother, don't worry, nobody does. But we have been able to reverse engineer it. Luckily, our friendly neighborhood data scientist, Sirkovitz, has done some good work on this in the past. And basically what Sirkovitz has said about this is the hand smoother looks at 3 hands before the game starts. It draws 3 hands, and then it presents you with what it believes to be the best quote-unquote spell to land ratio. And what that means mostly is you're most often going to get hands that have 3 lands and 4 spells, or 4 lands and 3 spells in your 17 land decks. The hand smoother also does not affect your draw step, it only affects your opening hand. And also, hand smoother, no hand smoother, the trend of you put more lands in your deck, you will draw more lands in your opening hand, and the opposite, you put fewer lands in your deck, you will on average draw fewer lands in your opening hand. That stays the same between best of 1 hand smoother and best of 3 or paper no hand smoother. And so this information comes out, people better understand how the hand smoother works, and we think, okay, maybe we can exploit this a little bit. Maybe we can skimp on lands, play 16 or 15 lands in our best of 1 decks, because this hand smoother is quite often going to give us an opening hand with a functional number of lands. That's another reason why we play 17 lands, so that your opening hand is functional. But with this hand smoother, it's like, oh, hold on, I can play fewer lands. It means I'm going to not flood as often, but also means that I'll have that functional opening hand quite often. So it seems like, just on its surface, that you should cut a land, because 16 is about as good as 17, and 1 fewer lands in your deck means that you'll flood less often. A problem arises, though, when you realize that since so many of your opening hands will have 3 or 4 lands in them, it cuts out the low end and the top end, which means very few of your opening hands will have 5 or more lands in them. And that sounds like a pretty good thing, right? It sounds like, you don't often want to draw 7 or 8 lands in the top 10 cards of your library. The problem here, though, is that if you are a deck that wants to hit its 4th land, and then its 5th land, and then its 6th land, and maybe even its 7th land, just think of a green deck or any blue control deck, your chances of doing that go down in best of 1 because you cut out all of those 5 land hands, or a lot of the 5 land hands, some of the 4 land hands, and it's going to push you to have 3 or fewer lands a lot of the time in your opening hand, which isn't good if you're somebody who is trying to hit their land drop. So this actually really hurts you. This hand smoother really hurts you if you're at all trying to cast 5-6 drops. So in the case of, yeah, my deck is going pretty big, I'm controlling, or I'm green ramp, I would say you definitely don't want to cut a land in best of one, because yes, it does help you when just to have that functional opening hand, but a functional opening hand isn't enough when you're planning to cast very big things, or you're planning for the game to go 8, 9, 10 turns, right? You really do want to start hitting your land drops at that point. And remember, the hand smoother doesn't affect your draw step, so if you have a 3 land opening hand in one of these decks that wants to keep hitting its land drops, even though you do have that functioning hand, that means your next draw steps won't be as good because you're less likely to hit a land when you actually want to. So then you think, okay, but what about my aggro decks? My aggro decks don't want to hit 6, 7, 8 lands very often. Can I cut a land in best of one for my aggro decks? Well, sometimes, of course, is the answer. I had Kyle Rose, the Ham TV, on the podcast about like 2.5 years ago at this point. This was pretty early in Limited Level Up's lifespan. And one thing that Kyle brought to the podcast, and he actually said this on his own podcast recently, he was talking about playing more lands in your aggro deck than people often do. Just the fact that people cut lands from their aggro decks more often than they should in Limited. Because in Limited, yes, you're going to have a nice curve of 1s and 2s and 3s in your aggro deck if you can help it. But you know what you're also going to have? 4 drops. Stuff like Cut In, if you're talking about Wilds of Eldraine. Stuff like Edgewell Pact, Grabby Giant. These 4s that you really want to play on turn 4. And if you're skimping on lands, that's just not going to happen as often. And especially as sets have been designed in ways that they give you good ways to spend your mana if you're flooding out a little bit, even in these aggro decks. You know, think Adventurers in Wilds of Eldraine. It's a really good example where the aggro deck doesn't just die if it drew an additional land that it couldn't use, right? It actually can use those lands pretty often. And Kyle's main argument was that it's much worse for the aggro deck to miss its 4th land than it is to draw a 7th land in the late game. Because most of your games are going to be about the first 4 turns. And if you, as the aggro deck, stumble in the first 4 turns, your plan just goes out the window, because the controlling deck, or the deck that, you know, is the control in the matchup, goes, oh great, you stumbled, that gives me an opportunity to come back here. So you really, really, really don't want to miss that window of being able to beat down. And I know this fights against a lot of people's intuition, because you remember those times you've played your aggro deck and you're like, oh, I drew too many lands and maybe I should cut a land. It's a hard feeling to fight against, but I very much agree with Kyle here that it is so much worse for your aggro deck just not to hit that 4th or even sometimes 5th land if you've got some number of 5 drops, even if your curve does look pretty low already. So are these people that are trying to exploit the hand smoother just wrong then? Well, no, I don't think so. I just think that it gets misapplied a little bit when you're talking about limited Magic. In a standard mono red deck where you've got a ton of 1-drops, a ton of 2s, not very many 3s, probably no 4s, and your deck is just all about efficiency, I think you should do this, because it doesn't really matter that you don't hit your 4th land drop in these decks. And a lot of times you don't want to. You've got all this burn that is going to just go to their face. But that's not how limited aggro decks play out. You do have expensive creatures. So if your limited deck does look something like a standard mono red deck, where you're like super, super low to the ground, I think it's a good idea to cut a land. But most other times, I just wouldn't try to go for it. I have an example of a deck in front of me here that I think a lot of people would play 16 lands in, but I'm playing 17. So for those not watching, I've got a red-white aggro deck, although it's mostly red. I've got an Ash Partycratcher in there and 2 Imidane's Recruiter. But I'm playing 17 lands in this deck, 12 mountains and 5 plains, because I think that's what this deck requires for casting its spells in a timely fashion. Those 2 Imidane's Recruiters, I don't mind getting to 5 mana. I've also got 2 Edgewell Pacts as 4 drops and Cut In as a 4 drop. And if you've ever been stuck on 3 mana in an aggro deck and you've got Cut In your hand and your opponent plays a good blocker and you're like, all right, I just need to draw that land. You know that feeling of not wanting to get that Cut In stuck in your hand. I've also got 4 copies of Ratcatcher Trainee, which is another place to put my mana in the late game. So yes, my deck here, it's more than 50% of it is in the 1 and 2 drop mana slots. But this deck overall really wants to hit its 4-on-4 and really wants to hit its 5-on-5 a lot of the time because of that recruiter. And the other thing here, like I was mentioning before, I am a red and white deck. Ash Partycrasher, which I have in my deck, that's a 2-drop. I want both red and white mana on turn 2, and going down a land, whether that be a plains or a mountain, just makes that a little bit less likely for that to happen. In contrast, I have another deck on screen now. I've got a mono red deck from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and the red decks in that format, you go super, super low to the ground, and I'm playing 13 mountains in this deck. This deck has 3 Iron Apprentices, 3 Kumano Faces Kakazans, a Simian Sling. I've only got 4 cards that cost more than 2 mana, so my curve is extremely low. I guess I also have 2 Iron Hoof Boars, but they're mostly just there for their +3/+1 channel ability. So my deck really is super, super low, and this is the kind of deck I think you should really be trying to exploit the hand smoother for. And I'm really, really exploiting it, because this deck does not mind if it doesn't hit its 4th land drop. It can still double spell once it hits the 3 lands. You know, it's gonna double spell with a 1 and a 2 very often, or sometimes even 3 1-drops. I don't want to be hitting 4, 5, 6 lands in this deck. So this is an extreme example, of course. I don't think these kind of decks come up that often, but I just wanted to show kind of where my head is at and in the kinds of decks I would be comfortable cutting a land, and the reasons why I don't think you should cut a land in a lot of your deck. So, where do I land on this one? I would say, myth plausible. You know, I think there is definitely times you should play 16 in your best of 1 decks, and that's when you don't have tricky mana requirements. You don't have, like, you know, white, white, red, red in your aggro decks, because that makes me want to go up lands. You don't have a lot of 4s and 5s, but you also don't have ways to spend your mana in the late game. Like, if I have a bunch of Ratcatcher trainees, like I mentioned, I'm still just going to play 17. The other thing I play here is lands are easy cuts. You know, you drafted a pretty good deck, and you're like, I don't know what to cut. You're like, okay, let's go for a land. I would highly recommend just trying to find whatever your worst card is if you believe your deck should play 17 lands. I don't think that's a good reason to go to 16. Also, the more things you have in your deck that approximate a land, stuff like Brave the Wilds or Utopia Sprawl or anything that goes searching up a land, there's where I'm like, okay, maybe you go to 16, but even still, decks with those kind of cards, those green decks, they want you keep hitting their land drops, like I mentioned. I think that it's definitely good to cut at some point a land or two, but I would want to have 2 or 3 of those kind of cards before I'm actively like, okay, let's go down a land here. And this is something that I actually came around on in the last year or two. I used to be one of these players that would just play 16 lands in the best of 1 decks, but the more and more I've heard good players talking about it, the more and more I kind of tried out the 17 lands. I do think it is the right thing to do. So I'll say plausible. Look for the times where you should play 16 lands, but I think 17 lands is still your default. Next up, we got another kind of more lighthearted one. This is Greed is Good. So you often hear this when people are drafted and they're like, ooh, can I squeeze in that 3rd or 4th color? Or should I take this 7-drop over this 2-drop? And you might actually think that I would say that this you shouldn't do this, be disciplined. I actually think Greed is Good is more true than not. So let me walk through this. I think it's important to define what greed exactly is, and to me, it's getting more power into your deck, even at the cost of some structural integrity, whether that be your curve or your mana base. And overall, I think that limited draft, and Magic in general actually, is all about trying to find the right balance of power in your deck versus consistency. Because obviously you could have a deck which is all the best cards you ever see in your draft, and play 5 colors with no fixing, and when it works, but when it's bad, it's going to be terrible. Or it could be 1 color, the other extreme, and take only cards of 1 color, and you're going to be passing on some powerful options, but hey, you're going to be able to cast your cards way more often than a 2-color deck or a 3-color deck. Part of becoming a better Magic player and a better drafter is understanding intuitively that balance more and more as you play. You'll know, okay, my deck is lacking a little bit of power here, but I open a good rare off color in pack 3, maybe I should try to splash that here. Versus, you got out of pack 2 with a great red-white aggro deck, and you open, let's just say a Lord Skitter. That's probably a good example. The black 3-drop rare that makes rats and exiles things from your opponent's grave. Really powerful card. But if your red-white aggro deck already has 19 really good cards in it, you don't need to stretch for that power. Your deck's probably going to be good by the end of pack 3 anyways. And I think an important distinction I would make about this whole topic is being greedy with your mana or putting more power into your deck because you feel like, yeah, you kind of need it, or you can just afford it because you picked up fixing early. Don't equate a quote-unquote greedy mana base, playing a bunch of colors, with a bad mana base, because I've got a deck in front of me here, and it's a blue-green base deck that's splashing 2 Torch the Towers, and it's splashing a Johan and a Virtue of Pestilence, which, you know, of course you can cast for 1 in a black as the adventure side, -3/-3, you gain 2 life. But you're going to, at some point, ideally want to cast the 5 black side, which is very hard to do in just a blue-green deck. It's generally hard to splash a 2-pipped card. So you might look in this deck and be like, oh man, this mana base so greedy. Like, what are you doing? You're really hoping to get lucky. But the math checks out here. This is not my deck, but this person here has a Scarecrow Guide. They've got an Evolving Wilds. They've got a Crystal Grotto. They're playing a Swamp and a Mountain to go get with their Wilds. They're playing 2 Return from the Wilds as another sources of fixing. They have a Brave the Wilds in there as well. So the math checks out on this deck. Yes, they're playing a lot of colors, but not to the degree where it's going to negatively impact them casting their spells in a timely fashion. I think that their mana base is actually a good mana base here, despite the fact they're playing 5 colors here. If you count there's a Twining Twins in there, if you count the white in there. So do not think, ooh, greedy, a lot of colors, with necessarily bad. It can be a bad mana base if the math doesn't check out. Your sources aren't intact, and if you don't quite have a grasp on the sources, the math for your source count, that's something you can look up. I would recommend, of course, Frank Karsten's article. Just type Frank Karsten mana base. You'll get some good information on that. But I think a lot of people look at these decks and go, oh man, like, that they're hoping to get lucky, but no, this is just a good mana base. You can cast your cards in a timely fashion, and I don't think you're going to have too much of a problem doing that in this deck. In fact, I think you should look for opportunities to take advantage of opening a good rare in pack 3 when you're set up to cast it. I didn't look at the draft for this one, but I imagine what happened was they were just blue-green base for most of the draft, and they opened a Virtue maybe in pack 3, maybe in pack 2, and we're like, hey, I'm kind of set up to do that. I've got the fixing. Or maybe what happened is they opened the Virtue, and blue and green were open, and so they moved in there. And they were like, okay, well, I'm going to make sure that I pick up into fixing to cast a double black card, which you do need a lot to do that. Don't get me wrong. But I do think they have that here, and they've done the work to make sure they can get that good card in their deck. And so, like I mentioned, it's all a trade-off of consistency versus power. If you don't have enough consistency, well, you're not going to be able to cast your cards. If you don't have enough power, if you're casting your cards, it doesn't matter if you're consistent. And an example of the opposite here is I have a deck that I did a deck tech for yesterday. It's a green-black deck, and green-black is one of the best decks in Wild of Eldraine, but I'm looking at this deck, and it's pretty low power. The best card in the deck is probably the Huntsman's Redemption, the Green Saga. But we've got like a bunch of monstrosities, 3 Troublemaker Oofs, like a Scream Puff, a Ferocious Werefox, just nothing too exciting in there. And so I looked at this deck, I'm like, okay, well, how can we make this deck the best possible? And I'm trying to move around the cards. And then I looked at the sideboard, I'm like, oh, you know what? There's a Spellbook Vendor in the sideboard. That's the 1 white 2/2 Vigilance Wear that you can pay a mana to put a roll on something each combat. And they've also got a Prophetic Prism in the sideboard. And in their deck already is an Evolving Wild. So I thought, you know what? This deck doesn't have the power it needs. It needs to get more power in there. And with 3 sources, the Prism, the Evolving Wilds, and the Plains that you're going to put in your deck to go search with Evolving Wilds, and also actually the Huntsman's Redemption is kind of sneaky fixing, because the second chapter you can sack a creature, go get a land if you really want to do that. So I feel like this deck needs the power. It needs to stretch its mana a little bit. I'm not all that excited about splashing Spellbook Vendor. It's a card that's a little bit better when you can cast it on turn 2 and turn 3, but it's still a powerful card, and this deck needs powerful cards. So my final verdict, confirmed. I would say Greed is good. As long as I'm talking to somebody who isn't like 10 years ago Alex that just tried to pay 5 colors with no fixing, as long as you kind of have a good idea of what makes a good multicolor deck, and you know how to weigh that balance of power versus consistency, I would say go for the greedy play when you think it's right to do. When it comes down to it, I think what wins a lot of games of limited magic, aside from just, casting all your spells, is power, right? Just at the end of the day, the person who has the more powerful cards is going to win a lot of the time. The next phrase we're going to look at is, it's a fast format, or it's a slow format. We're really trying to dig into what that means, if it actually helps you understand the format a little bit better, because I think sometimes this gets a little bit overblown. It's a fast format, or it's a slow format, or people put too much weight behind that when deciding how to build or draft their decks. This is another thing I've kind of danced around here and there in the past and haven't really gone deep on expressing some thoughts on. You'll hear myself and other content creators kind of wince a little bit when people ask, is it a fast format or is it a slow format? Especially early on in the format when it's really hard to tell. But my thoughts are that calling a format fast or slow these days in 2023 doesn't really help you draft all that much better. I think 10, 15 years ago, I think it was actually pretty helpful because there was a huge delta between the speed of sets. We had a set like Core Set 2014, where Opportunity, which is a 6-mana instant, 4 blue, draw 4 cards, was just the best card in the set, because that set was extremely slow, and your opponent could never beat you drawing 4 cards. And then a few years before that, we had the original Zendikar, which is often known as one of the fastest formats of all time, because you had all these common landfall creatures that got a bonus whenever you played a land, which meant that they were much bigger on your turn than on your opponent's turn, and you couldn't block with them, so you should just attack. So both players are just ships in the night attacking each other back, and I would say that was a very fast set. M14 was a very slow set, and it was good to understand that when you were drafting. For the really slow sets, it might mean, well, you don't have to play these bad 2-drops to fill out your curve. And for the really fast sets, it might just be like, yeah, that kind of good-looking 6-drop, you don't want to play that because everything's just about the early game. I do think set design in the past decade has a big influence on this. I think they purposely have tried to make sets more in a way that a bunch of different strategies are represented rather than just like, oh, this is a fast format. Because I don't actually think they intend them to be super fast or super slow back in the day. I think they tried to get a good mix here and there, but they just are better at doing that now. So, yes, certainly, if you're playing a set from 10 years ago, I think you can weigh speed as a bigger factor of how you want to build your deck. But then we take some more modern examples, and even in slow formats, you're going to want to play cheap cards. The good cheap cards these days are quite good. They don't make too many bad 2-drops. They're just like, well, I guess I have to play this to fill up my curve, but if it's a slow format, maybe I just won't play it. I'm going to look at Dominaria United here as the slowest limited format we've had since Arena started. Cards like Sunbathing Rootwalla, this is the green 2/2 that could pump itself equal to your domain, or Balmor, Battle Mage Captain, the blue-red is-it uncommon that pumped your team whenever you cast a spell. There were a ton of really good cheap cards in that format, and if I were to tell you, okay, well, Dominaria United is one of the slower draft formats out there, does that mean you shouldn't draft the cheap cards? No, of course not. The cheap cards are going to be good. Does that mean maybe that you want to play in for the late game? Certainly. But I do think some people take that as, oh, cheap cards aren't important, versus, well, the game's going to go on a little bit longer. And we contrast that with Phyrexia All-Be-One, which is one of the fastest formats we've had on Arena since 17 lands. And some of the best commons in that format were 4 and 5 mana cards. Chimney Rabble, the 4 mana 3/3 haste that comes with a 1/1 friend. Basilica Shepherd, the 5 mana 3/3 flyer that comes with 2 mites. These are some of the top commons in the format. Kaya, Intangible Slayer, is a good example of a rare, a 7-drop rare that, sure, you had to build your deck to get the 7 mana, but it wasn't like, nope, fast format can't play this card. I guess another way to put this is my curves don't look that different format to format these days. Yes, there's going to be slight differences. Maybe in Dominaria, the number of 2-drops you're aiming for is 6, and then in Phyrexia, maybe you're aiming for 8. Okay, that's a subtle change, but don't go too far off the deep end thinking expensive cards aren't playable in those faster formats, or in the slower formats that you should just ignore the cheap cards. My curve generally, broadly, if I'm to, look at it from 50 yards away, will look kind of the same. I do think that the people that will feel the effect of a faster format like Phyrexia are the people who naturally don't gravitate towards taking the cheap cards early. I think in 2023 Magic, the cheap cards are the good cards a lot of the time. So if your calibration on that is a little bit off, and just in your average draft format, you're somebody who ends up closer to, 4 or 5 2-drops rather than 6 or 7, then you're going to really feel that impact when your opponents come to the table with 10 cheap cards and you've only got 6. But I think a good baseline to have for most formats is hitting that 6, 7 2-drop. So that might be something that you're feeling even more if you're a little bit off on that. Like I mentioned in Dominaria, I still want those cheap cards, and that didn't change that much. But the people that maybe would gravitate to drafting 4 or 5 2-drops rather than 6 or 7 on average, they felt that a little bit less. They felt that pressure a little bit less in Dominaria United because they could get away with a little bit more. I think that dynamic's at play a little bit. So what does this all boil down to? Because I am sort of sending a mixed message here. I'm saying both at the same time that, yes, Dominaria United is it feels noticeably slower than Phyrexia All-Be-One, but also, don't worry, don't draft all that much differently, have your curve looking approximately the same. Well, I think it boils down to my message will be different to different people. And I've mentioned this before on different podcasts, but often I'm talking to a large audience. I can't specify to you who tends to take 2-drops early anyways, or you who tends to not like to take 2-drops and gravitates towards the 4 and the 5-drops, the big flashy things. Put yourself somewhere on that spectrum of I prioritize cheap cards really, really highly, or I know I'm somebody who doesn't take the cheap cards as highly as I should. If there is one of those formats that people say, hey, it's kind of fast, and you're one of those people who doesn't prioritize those cheap cards, just push yourself. Be like, I know I have to eat my vegetables. I know I have to take these cheap cards. But if you feel like you already have a good sense of, yeah, I take cheap cards when I should, and I take the good cheap cards pretty highly, I don't think you have to change your strategy all that much. I think that's what it boils down to. Because look, there is a notable difference. I'm not trying to say all sets are the same. Speed doesn't matter. Certainly not. I'm just trying to say that formats are more nuanced than this is fast, this is slow, therefore you should take these type of cards, and you should just be aware of that and be aware of who you are as a drafter already. So the final verdict on is calling a format fast or slow actually helpful? Does it actually help you draft better? It's plausible. It depends who you are. I know people in my Discord who basically only draft aggro decks, and when they get put in one of these fast formats, it doesn't feel like that much faster than any other format. But if you're somebody who super gravitates towards these slow decks, when you get beaten down by a good 1 and 2, a 2 and 2, a 3 pretty often, because you don't have those cheap cards in your deck as often as you maybe should, it's going to feel like a much faster format. Next saying, and I think this is going to be a pretty quick one, is you often hear limited Magic players go, whoa, 4th pick Candy Grapple, that means black's open, or, something along the lines of, whoa, 4th pick this card, that's crazy that's here, that's like such a good common. But the early picks of a draft, picks 1, 2, 3, 4, they don't mean that much signal-wise. I mean, sure, somebody didn't take that Candy Grapple, they saw it in a pack, they took something else. But especially because Candy Grapple is a common, and you can apply this to basically any common, it means that you should look what was taken in the pack. Was a rare taken? Were all 3 uncommons taken? Sometimes I've heard people say this, wow, black must be open, I got a 4th pick Candy Grapple, and the rare and 2 uncommons are gone. I can certainly imagine a rare and 2 uncommons that are better than Candy Grapple. You could open a pack like I have in front of me here. The rare is Spectre of Mortality, which is the 5-drop flyer 3/3 that enters the battlefield. You exile cards from your graveyard, and all creatures get -X, where X is the number of cards you've exiled. You got the Witch's Vanity, which is the black uncommon saga that kills a 2-drop and then makes some tokens. And you've also got a Candy Grapple in this pack, and a few other good cards like, Grabby Giant and Werefox. I don't think that Spectre of Mortality is a better card than Vanity or Grapple, but I could certainly see somebody thinking so, and they take that pick 1, then this pack gets passed, and the next person takes a Witch's Vanity, and then the third person who sees this pack, well, maybe they took, like, Gruff Triplets into Tough Cookie, and they want to just take the Ferocious Werefox here instead of the Candy Grapple. I don't claim that to be right or wrong, but that's something that somebody easily could do. And then you get this pack, and you're like, wow, Candy Grapple. Even if there's 2 uncommons in the pack still. Don't take that as such a heavy signal, as I should definitely latch onto black here. This leads into a bigger point that I'm sure I'm going to cover on some future episode, just going deep on signals, because I think it's a little bit of a misunderstood concept. Basically, what I'm trying to get at here is, for the first 5 picks of the draft, you should just be taking the best card. And of course, I would take that Candy Grapple in that spot if I saw it 4th pick. But don't think that means that black is open. You should just immediately nosedive into black and put the blinders on. There is still a good chance that the people passing to you are also in black. So pretty firm busted on this one. And this is a trap that I do see a lot of players falling into, just trying to read too deeply into the signals too early on. I've often said that signals really kick in around pick 6, 7, 8, because that's when most of the good cards are taken out of the pack. There's usually not 7 or 8 first pick quality cards. And what's left will give you a better idea with what's actually open, because those are the cards that people didn't take when they could have taken a good card. Next one up is the saying, that card is impossible to answer, and I can't win this game. This really was something that I heard a lot during Phyrexia Albi-1 with the card Thrun, Breaker of Silence. This is the 5 mana, 3 green, 5/5, can't be countered, has trample, it can't be the target of non-green spells, and has indestructible as long as it's your turn. How the heck do you kill this thing? Well, the answer is you don't. You just try to win the game. You're not supposed to try to kill the Thrun. There is a difference between how do I answer this threat and how do I beat this threat, right? Answering it means, well, I'm getting off the battlefield, and this has very few answers to it. You need like a bite spell or something. But beating it is different. You don't need to answer all of your opponent's cards to win a game of Magic. Another thing Magic players like to say is the best kind of removal is player removal. So when my opponent played a Thrun, I think, all right, now it's time for me to switch gears. Maybe I was playing a little bit more of a mid-rangey or controlling game, and now I have to beat down. I have to be the one to kill them before the Thrun kills me, because that thing is going to kill me in a few turns. And cards like Thrun are going to disproportionately affect you if you're somebody who likes to gravitate towards control decks. And this Thrun was printed for being good against control decks in constructed formats, right? They didn't print this card just to ruin limited formats for people who like playing slower decks. But if you're somebody who likes to draft control decks, the more controlling your deck is, the more of your opponent's deck you will see, because the game is going to go longer, you're trying to drag out the game, and the more that these kind of cards are going to punish you. Thrun's not going to punish you as badly if you're playing a red-white aggro deck. By the time they cast this, sure, it's a pretty good blocker, but you can go around them, and the way to beat this card is attacking around it. Either when they've tapped it, turned it sideways to attack you, or maybe you just have enough creatures that can go around, they eat 1 and you're dealing 7 damage, so it doesn't matter. Again, I really want to impose the idea that beating a card is not the same as answering it, right? You can beat a card multiple ways. You don't have to directly get it off the battlefield. Yes, it's frustrating. I'm not trying to say that, those people are frustrated by this card, they're just doing it wrong. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. I'm just trying to say that it's easy to get locked into, well, this card's absurd. How do I ever beat this? When beating and answering, like I said, aren't quite the same thing. Now, when you get to something like Gruff Triplets, which is pretty absurd and one of the best limited bombs we've had in a very, very long time, the reason why Gruff Triplets is so busted compared to something like Thrun, even though this is answerable, quote unquote, is Not only is it very good against the strategies that just have a bunch of removal spells, these control decks that are trying to just answer all the threats, because this is 3 threats that you kill one, the other ones grow bigger. But even against the aggro decks, it's a fantastic stabilizer, right? Just comes down and blocks multiple things. So Gruff Triplets, yeah, you guys have grievance with Gruff Triplets, but I do think for those kind of hexproof style cards, people get really frustrated at hexproof, and I get it. It is a frustrating mechanic to run into. Just don't think it's game over when your opponent plays one. So I'm given that card is impossible to answer. I can't win. Affirm, plausible. But plausible leaning towards busted. Because yes, there are game states where you just got 3 removal spells in hand, you don't have any pressure on board, and Thrun comes down, and you just can't kill them before the Thrun kills you. But the real practical thing to get out of this example is when a bomb comes down, it could be a Thrun or it could just be anything. I think it's very easy to let that tilt you. And not tilt you as like you're smashing your keyboard and you're like, oh, this is so frustrating, but tilt you as like, you get that brain fog kind of tilt. You're like, oh, that's really bad. It's a bad thing that happened. And you kind of like focus on that. I think that once you kind of get a sense of, all right, they played a good card. It's not the end of the world, especially a card that might be a little bit hard to, again, answer, get off the battlefield. Take a deep breath. Just go, all right, what are my options from this point? And that can be applicable to anything in a game of Magic where it doesn't go right for you. We're like, oh, that was really bad. You can kind of feel defeated, deflated in the moment where you're like, oh, well, you're not playing your best. You're not focused anymore because that was a bad thing that happened to you and the game's not going your way. I suffered from this a lot when I first started playing. I was like, oh, the first instance of the game not going right for me, I'd be like, well, I mean, what can I do at this point? There's a lot you can do. There's probably more that you can do than you think. Not in every single game, but in a lot of games. Next up is something I see a lot on Discord or on Twitter or Reddit or just somewhere where people are posting their decks they want feedback on. They often say, my deck was so good, there's no way my deck should have went 1-3. Well, number one, let me just say that I think predicting the record for your deck before you play isn't all that helpful. I mean, you can certainly say your deck is strong or your deck is weak, but as far as how that translates into a actual record, there's going to be variance in there. You might run into bad matchups, you might get mana screwed, whatever. Any amount of variance in there, and I think that you're kind of setting yourself up for disappointment if you set an expectation for yourself that you're going to win. You can set the expectation of, hey, this deck is good. That's certainly fine. And I think it's good to be able to evaluate that. But you're setting yourself up for disappointment sometimes when you're trying to rate your deck as a record or the expected record. And I think just in general, don't get caught up in an expectation is good advice for keeping your cool in a game of Magic or just in Magic in general, whether you're drafting or whether you're playing. One of the reasons your deck could have gone 1-3 is you didn't play that well, right? Certainly a lot of people come to the table and are like, oh, I drafted so many good cards, and maybe their play is just not up to par. The other thing I notice often when people say, oh, my deck was so good, how did I go 1-3? Is, yeah, it had some powerful cards in it, but there's probably something about your deck you're missing. You missed that, your curve's not that good. Or you missed that, hey, your mana base is like way worse than you thought it was. You're trying to splash 2 cards here off of 2 sources. That's just not right. Or another thing that's pretty common is your top 5 cards in your deck are excellent. You've got like Gruff Triplets and Welcome to Sweet Tooth, maybe 2 other good rares. But your 15 worst cards are really, really bad, meaning probably your lane wasn't that open. So if you find yourself saying this often, if you're like, oh man, there's no way this deck should have 1-3. 1, I would say, of course, look for feedback if you can. A second set of eyes is often very helpful in these situations, but 2, really don't get caught up in an expectation how the deck should perform. That's how you set yourself up for tilting, honestly. Expectations are truly the root of all tilt. I think in a game of Magic, I think that when you set yourself up for like, I'm gonna do this well, when that doesn't happen, that can be kind of disheartening. So this one gets a firm busted. I think a deck can go 1-3 for a multitude of reasons, but also be aware that your deck might not actually be as good or as structurally sound as you think it is. Next up is that moment when you're at the local game store or maybe playing in a big event, and you go up to your friend, you ask them, well, how did you do last round? They go, didn't win, I lost because I got flooded or got mana screwed. And that's certainly a valid excuse in a lot of games. Like, there's going to be some games where you don't hit that 3rd land drop, or where you did draw 9 lands in your top 15 cards or something. That's going to happen in your game of Magic. But sometimes when people say this, I look at their game logs and they flooded, quote unquote, because they drew 1 more land than they would have liked. You're like, I flooded, I wish that was a spell. Is that really flooding though? Especially when maybe you've drawn, the game's just gone kind of long and you've drawn the average number of lands that you should expect for a 10, 11, 12 turn game. You're at 8 lands, but that's about what you should draw. Like, your opponent may have drawn more spells than you, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you got flooded. I think this kind of is used as a crutch a lot of the time to explain, why you lost the game. And the way I kind of think about it is drawing the right land to spell ratio is kind of your error of margin in a game of Magic. And the closer to a good ratio that your deck gives you, just, perfect, exactly the right number of lands, exactly the right number of spells, the more mistakes you can afford to make. But when you're leaning towards getting screwed or getting flooded, you need to make sure every play is the right one because your margin of error is smaller. And I bring this up because often in a game where somebody drew 1 extra land or maybe 2 extra lands, and yeah, certainly I can agree, it would have been nice if those were spells. I also pointed out, yeah, but you made 2 mistakes here, 2 small mistakes on turn 3 and turn 7. And they might come back with an answer like, oh yeah, but those are like very, very small mistakes. That's true. And maybe if you had drawn an extra spell, it wouldn't have mattered. That small mistake wouldn't have mattered. Maybe it could be a mistake as small as, well, you played a land before you played your Prophetic Prism, and that land was an Evolving Wilds, and you drew into an untapped land, and that untapped land would have allowed you to cast something. Just like a very small thing like that. You really have to be tight when the game is not already going well for you. If it's already kind of going bad, you've drawn too many lands or too few lands. So I lost because I got flooded or got screwed. I'm going to give a solid plausible here. Lots of games I've reviewed and gone, yeah, you know what? You did just get flooded. There was really nothing you could do. You played to the best that you possibly could here. But don't use it as a crutch. It might not have been the reason that you lost. It might have been that you got flooded, and because of the little mistakes you made, it made getting flooded even worse for you. So in those games where you're feeling flood or screw, flip that Ash Ketchum hat back around and go, you know what? Now I've got to play my absolute tightest because I can't afford any mistakes. My deck is already trying to make me lose. I can't afford anything past this. There's this concept that I've mostly heard applied to Constructed, but I think you can apply it to Limited too. That when you're deck building, you're trying to build a deck that functions no matter how many lands you draw, or I should say in a large range of lands you could possibly draw. There are some decks that only function if they hit exactly 4 lands and no more or no fewer. Like you're like this like mid-range Boros deck, like a big red deck that you want to hit your lands to be able to cast your expensive spells, but you don't use mana that well in the late game. Contrast that with like a green-black mid-range deck in Standard right now, where you've got Mosswood Dread Knights and the Cottage, just good ways to spend your mana early and good ways to spend your mana late. So if you draw too few lands in the early game, that's okay. You have good cheap cards, you have cards to help you hit your land drops. But if you draw too many lands later, well, you got these cottages, these lands that you can activate. It's the same kind of thing in Limited as well. You don't have as much control over that, but often if you find, man, I'm really flooding with this deck. I mean, sure, it could just be variance, but you might not have drafted enough good expensive things or enough ways to spend your mana in the late game. Or if you're getting mana screwed, it might be that you're not playing enough cheap cards. You just drew 3 lands and you couldn't cast your 4s. You had too many 4s, and yeah, you're going to get mana screwed more often there. So try to draft in a way, and this is kind of an abstract concept, try to draft in a way where you're okay, you can be functional on 3 or 4 lands, but you're also not just dead in the water if you happen to draw that 8th land. That's a tricky line to walk. It's not always going to be possible. Kind of just an idea I want to kind of float past you. Next up is how many X is too many X? You know, sometimes people say, how many Torch the Towers is too many Torch the Towers? Or how many Hamlet Gluttons is too many Hamlet Gluttons? And this is one that I do think people say more in jest than not. Usually it's when it's a very good card. It's like, oh, how many of this card is too many of this card? Of course, Torch the Tower is not a card I'm going to mind having 5 copies of. But I do think there is something behind this and something that's interesting to talk about. And it's, how many copies of a card do you want in a given deck? Or how many copies of something are you happy with that you're going to be like, I'm going to take the first 2, but not the third one? I'm again going to reach out to Constructed and talk about why they play 4, 3, or 2 or 1 copies of a card in their deck. And this is broad, all decks are going to be different. But generally when you have 4 copies of a card, it means I want to draw this every single game. I'm happy drawing multiples. They don't really have diminishing returns. It's either a really good spell or a key part of my deck. When you have 3, usually it's like, okay, I want to see this card every single game, but I don't want to draw too many of them. I wouldn't be happy drawing 3 of them. You'll often see this with Legends in Constructed, where people will play 3 copies of a Legend rather than 4, because, you know, drawing multiple Legends can be awkward. When you get to 2, it's like, all right, I would like to see this every game or most games, but drawing 2 is pretty bad. Usually this is a really expensive card, or something that is kind of a narrow answer. Something like destroy a cheap creature only, or destroy an expensive creature only. And then when you get to 1 copy, it's like, it's a narrow card, you only really want 1. It's either tutorable, you can go search it out somehow, or it's a card that, you know, in multiples, they just have diminishing returns. That's kind of how I think about it in limited too. So a card like Torch the Tower, really, there's no upper limit on the number of Torch the Towers. I mean, sure, hypothetically, you probably don't want 10 of them, but realistically, I will draft as many Torch the Towers as I can get. Then you have something like Hamlet Glutton, which is a card I don't mind drawing multiples of, but does have diminishing returns. Both because it's a 5-drop, and because you do want to cast this for 5 mana, not 7, and you only have so much bargain fodder. You can't just bargain every single time when you cast a Hamlet Glutton. So that one has a bit more diminishing returns. I would say, I don't know, depending on the deck, maybe a deck that's super bargain heavy, 4 would probably be my limit, where I'm like, all right, I'm not going to draft another Hamlet Glutton after this. So if you're actually asking yourself, is this too many copies of this thing? Kind of use that scale. Kind of ask yourself, am I happy drawing multiples? Is this an expensive card? Obviously, the cheap cards you're going to be happy playing more copies of than the expensive cards, but don't just write it off because it's an expensive card. Some expensive cards, I would say Hamlet Glutton is pushing the upper limit of this, where it's like, yeah, you know what, this card is actually really good, and I don't mind drawing 4 of them or whatever, as long as my deck is set up to cast them. And something that people often ask is about legendary creatures. Like I mentioned, Constructed, they usually play 3, not 4. I think in Limited, you often don't get too many copies of legendary creatures because they're at uncommon. There's not common legendary creatures. And so you don't often run into this problem, but for a good legend, especially a cheap legend, because those tend to die pretty early on, you know, something like Ruby from Wilds of Eldraine, any 2-drop or 3-drop, people tend to point removal spells at the good legends. You don't mind playing 2 or 3 a lot of the time because you're going to play one, you're going to trade it off, you're going to cast your other one. The awkwardness of having multiple legends you're not going to feel it that much. The more expensive legends, like a 4 or 5 mana legend, has already got the issue of it's a 4 or 5 mana card. You don't want too many of those. That I might be a little bit more tepid on. Like Sir Armont might be a good example. The green-white uncommon from this set that puts a roll on something and then gives all your enchanted creatures +1/+1. I'd probably want 2 copies of that, not 3, because by the time you cast that card, you might have accrued another copy or 2 in your hand, and you can't cast the other ones until you trade them off. With the early creatures, it's a lot easier to trade off or have your opponent just point a removal spell at, and then you're like, all right, my second legend's not that bad here. All right, next we have one that a lot of people commented. How is this still in the pack? This is just such the classic. You're at your local game store, there's that one guy who just says out loud, how is this still in the pack? But I do want to talk about this in a little bit. So if you find yourself saying that either out loud or in your head, then it means, 1, if you're consistently getting a ton of really good cards late, you're probably drafting with people that don't draft as much as you do or don't know as much about the format as you do. And so I would just recommend not saying that out loud. And it kind of makes the person next to you feel like, oh, did I pass good cards? Did I unintentionally pass good cards? It doesn't add that much to the conversation. It also might mean, though, that you're overvaluing a certain card. Maybe you're the one who's not in the know and you're like, oh wow, this card's so good, but the rest of the table knows that it's actually not that good. You know, a Stab Wound, that actually might be a good example from Wilds of Eldraine. I think people who are really in tune with the set know that Stab Wound isn't actually that good in this set, but I think that's definitely a card you could see somebody thinking it's much better than it is and going, whoa, how's that still in the pack 7th or something? So just be careful about that. You also might just be in the right lane, right? Maybe that's the obvious answer. How is this still in the pack? Well, your colors are open. You know, not, oh, everybody at the table. You're not going to have tables all the time that perfectly self-correct and perfectly draft and all the colors are divided exactly how they should be. Maybe you're just in green and nobody else really is, and you've done a good job of drafting. In that case, you don't have to rub it in people's face once again. The other thing, too, is that Pack 1, Pack 2, and Pack 3 are all going to be different for what you expect to see. Pack 1, yeah, you shouldn't expect to see too many good cards. People are just taking the best cards. Pack 2, you should expect to see cards of the color that was not open in Pack 1, because, of course, the packs go opposite directions, so that's going to swap. And then Pack 3, that's the pack where there should be no surprises, or there shouldn't be anything that's like, whoa, that's crazy, because people are settled in their lane. They can't take that Imidane's Recruiter, or whatever that awesome card is. You might get it 4th pick. So don't be too shocked about it. I'm sure, you know, obviously we're going to have that superficial, oh wow, that's a great card here. But number 1, I would say if you're at your local game store, just, you know, keep it to yourself, keep it on the DL. But also, if from a strategic perspective, it doesn't always mean that somebody at the table has misevaluated this card, or the entire rest of the table has misevaluated this card. You might have misevaluated the card, Or again, your colors could just be very open and that explains it. Or you could be in pack 3 where you expect good cards to be flying around and the people that are in the right colors get rewarded and they get to draft the good cards late. And then our last one here is one of my favorites. Never didn't have it. Of course, this is set in a situation where a player maybe keeps a risky hand where it's like, all right, I really need to hit that 3rd land drop. And if I don't, this hand's really bad, but they hit it right on time. And everybody watching is like, they never didn't have, of course. LSV is very famous for this. He'll always, kind of in a showboaty way sometimes, make a play that looks like, I'm really gambling here. And then it works out, and it's like, of course it worked out. That's LSV. It worked out for him. But I think the reason it works out for good players, more often than not, is you're not just taking a risk in the dark. You're taking a calculated risk. I can't tell you the number of times I've watched LSV draft, keep a 1-land hand, and then get there. Hits the 2nd land, hits the 3rd land. And it looks absurd to some people. It's like, of course, it was just luck. But really, what's going on behind the scenes is he's weighing, I'm on the draw, which means I'm more likely to draw a land. And I have 17 lands in this deck. So that means, the odds are already in my favor. And I have this 2-drop card in hand that helps me hit my land drop. Maybe it's a Prophetic Prism. And the rest of my hand's not that expensive. So I can afford to take this risk here. You'll see this a lot, actually. If you pay attention to high-level games, you'll see people taking these lines that just look like they're getting really, really lucky. But it's not they're just getting lucky because that's who they are. It's because they put themselves in good situations to get lucky. One of my favorite Lords Limited episodes is episode 23, I believe. It's Making Your Own Luck. Really, really good episode to listen to if you want a little bit more insight on, number 1, tilt management, but number 2, just setting yourself up to get lucky. One of their best episodes, honestly. And it goes into this concept. So, really, myth of never didn't had it, it's confirmed. Most of the time where the good player makes a risky play like that, they feel like it's the right play to make. So, never didn't have it as a saying, I'd say it's confirmed. A lot of times when you see those risky moves, those risky lines from good players, it's not a super risky move. It just kind of looks like that when you're not considering the rest of the context of the game or their deck or just something that you're not quite seeing the bigger picture on. Obviously, some risks don't pay off, and you'll see the risks don't pay off sometimes. I've had multiple games playing against LSV in the team drafts where maybe he'll keep a hand that's kind of like this, needs one thing to get there, and doesn't get there. But that's a calculated risk that was made, and sometimes those calculated risks don't pay off. All right, thank you so much for watching and listening. I hope this was a fun episode. It was a fun episode for me. Hope you got both some entertainment and some knowledge out of it. Next week, and the weeks after that, we're ramping it up. It's going to be Ixalan season very, very soon. So there's probably going to be one show in between now and then. But set reviews coming up. Mark is going to be back with me. So stick around for that. And thanks for listening and watching, everybody.